This chapter is on the respiratory system. The respiratory system is anatomically divided into two different regions, the upper and the lower respiratory tracts. So when you get an upper respiratory infection, it's going to be in one of these areas. The upper respiratory tract is going to begin with the nasal cavity. It's going to include various sinuses like the frontal sinus, the sphenoidal sinus. We also have two additional sinuses as well, which are not shown on this diagram. There is the maxillary sinus, which is going to be right just inferior to your eyeballs, as well as the ethmoidal sinus in the ethmoid bone. In addition to the sinuses, we also have the beginning of the upper respiratory tract here. The throat area is called the pharynx. Below the pharynx, just inferior to it, would be the larynx or the voice box. And that's where the end of the upper respiratory system ends. The lower respiratory system begins with the windpipe, which is more commonly, or which is anatomically referred to as the trachea. The trachea then, once it splits at this area, it's then going to bifurcate or divide. And when it divides, it then becomes the primary bronchi at this point. And so those large bronchi then are going to continue to split to become smaller and smaller tubes, eventually leading to bronchioles. Those bronchioles end or terminate with a region called the alveolus. And the alveolus is the site of gas exchange. Also in the lower respiratory tract would, of course, be the lungs containing the alveoli, bronchi, and bronchioles. The pleura, remember, are the serous membranes that are found in the ventral cavity. In this case, it's in the thoracic cavity, specifically the pleural cavity, and it would be the parietal and visceral pleura, followed by the diaphragm. The diaphragm is the main skeletal muscle that is involved with breathing. So the respiratory tract can be functionally divided into two main areas: the conducting portion, where air transport occurs. So its main job is to conduct the air down to a certain point. And then after that, the respiratory portion begins, and it's called this because that's where gas exchange actually happens. And it's going to be defined as having the presence of alveoli. The alveolus, or alveoli for plural, is the location where gas exchange actually occurs. Functions of the respiratory system include breathing, obviously, which is termed pulmonary ventilation. So when a patient cannot breathe on their own, that's when they need a ventilator. And this process includes cycles of inhalation, which is inspiration, and exhalation, which is expiration. Other important functions of the respiratory system include gas exchange, and gas exchange includes two main processes. There is external respiration, and that's gas exchange between the atmosphere and the blood. And this particular part actually occurs in the alveoli. And so the alveoli are obviously inside the lungs, but remember, all the air that is traveling into the respiratory tract, eventually ending at the alveolus, is still technically external to the body. There's a membrane at the alveolus where oxygen diffuses from the alveolus into the blood, and that is external respiration. Then the blood is going to travel all throughout the body. It goes back to the left side of the heart, where it then travels to the systemic tissues. At that point, internal respiration is going to occur. And that's gas exchange that's between the blood as well as the body cells. So before the gas starts to travel or be conducted eventually to the alveoli, gas conditioning happens, and conditioning means that gas will be warmed, humidified, as well as cleansed. And one of the roles of the nasal cavity is this gas conditioning. So the sequences and events that occur between the respiratory and circulatory systems are what we just talked about first. The first step is external respiration. And again, it is what occurs at the alveoli. There's going to be gas exchange at a membrane in the alveolus. Then the oxygen is going to be transported to the cells by the circulatory or cardiovascular system. Once the respiratory gases reach the tissues, it diffuses from the blood into the cells. So the cells use oxygen and generate a waste product called carbon dioxide, and that's internal respiration here. So we see movement of gases from the blood into the tissues. Whereas for external respiration, it goes from the alveoli into the blood. Then the circulatory system is going to transport the carbon dioxide to the lungs. And then the last step is that the carbon dioxide is exhaled through expiration by the respiratory system. When we look at this anatomy of the respiratory tract, I want you to notice that the pharynx, again, which is commonly called the throat, is divided into three separate regions. The first part is the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and then the laryngopharynx. On the cadaver image that is to the right, we can see here that this is showing the nasopharynx, and that's not quite showing because of the color. So let me write that just a little below that, nasopharynx. So you should be able to identify this. And you can see the location of this begins at the back of the nasal cavity. This is the nasal cavity. And then it continues down to the bottom of the soft palate, which is the uvula. This is showing the anatomy of the respiratory tract here. You can see the two main sinuses that we've already discussed here. The nasal cavity is going to have various structures, which are called meatuses. And the posterior region of the palate is called the soft palate here. And specifically, it's in this region right here where I have the laser pointer. So when we look at this image of the cadaver, this would be the soft palate. And at the very bottom of the soft palate, in this area right here, this is actually the uvula. Also shown on the diagram to your left are the three different regions of the pharynx. So the pharynx has the three major regions, the nasopharynx, oropharynx, as well as laryngopharynx. So the pharynx is shared by both the respiratory and digestive tracts. The nasopharynx is going to be only respiratory, but the oropharynx as well as The laryngopharynx are going to be both respiratory as well as digestive. They're lined with mucosa and different types of mucosa based on the location. They have skeletal muscle for control of swallowing. Remember that skeletal muscle is actually voluntary. So you make a conscious decision to actually contract your throat. But then once it gets a little deeper to the lower parts of the esophagus, for example, it's smooth muscle. So the pharynx is posterior to the nasal cavity and superior to the soft palate. It's lined with pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, whereas the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx are going to be a little bit different. Normally only air passes through this part of the pharynx. There's some exceptions to that. For example, when you drink milk and you laugh while you're drinking the milk, it will go upward. It will go up into the nasal cavity and it'll come out your nose. The oropharynx is going to be shared by the digestive and the respiratory system. And because the digestive system is exposed to it, it has non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium to resist abrasion from food. In the case of the laryngopharynx, it also is part of the digestive system, so that's why it also has non-stratified squamous epithelium for the same purpose, to resist abrasion from food.